On November 24, 1859, an English naturalist, Charles Darwin, published a work of scientific literature commonly known as The Origin of Species. It theorized that all diversities of life shared a common descent. Few will deny the tremendous impact Darwin's book had on the world. His work has had a greater influence on the study of life sciences than anything written before or since that time. Sadly, however, Darwin's contribution does not end in the classroom or in the scientific journal. The publishing of The Origin of Species marked a turning point in the way society viewed the value of human life. Many of the most egregious atrocities of the 20th century can be traced back to the theory Darwin set forward in this book. At some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. The break between man and his nearest allies will then be wider, for it will intervene between man and a more civilized state, as we may hope, even then the Caucasian, and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of now between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla. Charles Darwin's twofold thesis that man is descended from a hairy-tailed quadruped and that we are descended from barbarians was a considerable stimulus to the racism in the 19th and 20th centuries. Charles Darwin was thought to be suspect of the transmutation of species theory, the theory of the time that foreshadowed the modern theory of evolution, partially due to the lack of a mechanism, but also due to what he described as missing links between humans and animals. This all changed in 1831 while on his famous Beagle expedition. While exploring the island of Tierra del Fuego, he first encountered the native Fuegians. He noted in his journal they seemed to be miserable, degraded savages, and he no longer saw an unbridgeable gap between humans and animals. At last, Darwin had found his missing link. 20 years later, he completed his book, which later became known as The Origin of Species. The original title, which was used in the first 5 publishings, made it much more apparent as to how much racial inferiority played into his findings. The original title was On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. We civilized men, we build asylums for the imbecile, the maimed, and the sick. We institute poor laws, and our medical men exert their utmost skill to save the life of everyone to the last moment. Thus, the weak members of civilized society propagate their kind. No one who has attended to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of man. Hardly anyone is so ignorant as to allow his worst animals to breed. The publication of Darwin's Origin of Species in 1859 was undoubtedly a turning point in the life of Francis Galton, the cousin of Charles Darwin. Galton was among the first to recognize the implications for mankind of Darwin's theory of evolution. In 1869, he wrote to Darwin, "The appearance of your Origin of Species formed a real crisis in my life. Your book drove away the constraint of my old superstition. If it had been a nightmare, it was the first to give me freedom of thought." He believed that talent, character, and intellect were all inherited from one's ancestors, as was any lack of these qualities. In 1883, he coined the term eugenics for the study of ways of improving the physical and mental characteristics of the human race. By the early 1900s, the eugenics movement had made its way to the United States. By the mid-1920s, half of the U.S. states had laws allowing for the compulsory sterilization of those held in custody who were deemed to be unfit. This resulted in the forced sterilization of some 70,000 victims, including criminals, the mentally retarded, drug addicts, the poor, the blind, the deaf, and people with epilepsy, tuberculosis, or syphilis. One of the most influential leaders of the movement was Margaret Sanger. When arguing for eugenics, Sanger quoted Darwin as an authority when discussing natural checks of the population. She was the founder of the American Birth Control League. She believed that birth control was not only important with respect to controlling the numbers of unfit in the population, but was the only viable means to improve the human race. She opened her first birth control clinic in 1916 in the impoverished Brownsville section of Brooklyn to help control the problem of overbreeding. Initially, the clientele she wished to attract were immigrant Southern Europeans, Slavs, Latins, and Jews. As her organization grew, Sanger set up more clinics in the communities of other dysgenic races, such as blacks and Hispanics. Sanger, in alliance with eugenicists and through initiatives such as the Negro Project, exploited black stereotypes in order to reduce the fertility of African Americans. Sanger once addressed the women's branch of the Ku Klux Klan in Silver Lake, New Jersey, and received a dozen invitations to speak to similar groups. Sanger and the American Birth Control League worked hard to spread her eugenic ideas about, in her words, human weeds through the 1930s and into the 1940s. After World War II, partly to disassociate from what many people believed was a connection between eugenics and the Holocaust, the American Birth Control League changed their name. The new name they chose was Planned Parenthood.
Well, I think the greatest sin in the world is bringing children into the world that have disease from their parents, that have no chance in the world to be a human being, practically. Delinquents, prisoners, all sorts of things just marked when they're born. That, to me, is the greatest sin.
In 1891, a 13-year-old boy in the country of Georgia took out a book from a little bookshop. He was so entranced by the book and its message that he read it all night, forgetting to sleep. When his mother chided him about going to sleep, he replied, "I loved the book so much, Mummy, I couldn't stop reading." A few days later, that boy was lying on the grass outside town, sitting, talking with some of his friends. The young boy declared, "God's not unjust. He doesn't actually exist. We've been deceived. If God existed, he'd have made the world more just." The book was Darwin's Origin of Species, and the young boy was Joseph Stalin. During his 23 years in power, Stalin and his communist regime were responsible for over 20 million deaths.
Was wir uns unter der deutschen Jugend der Zukunft wünschen, ist etwas anderes, als was die Vergangenheit sich gewünscht hat. Wir müssen einen neuen Menschen nennen, auf das unser Volk nicht an den typischen Degenerationserscheinungen dieser neuen Zeit zugrunde geht.
The connection between Darwinian ideas and Hitler's ideology are obvious. However, Hitler takes Darwin's theory to the next level. Creation and science professor at Ozark Christian College, Jeff Robertson, explains.
What this becomes is a tragic and yet very probably the most prominent example we have from actual history of what would happen if you took all of this, took it out of the realm of just theory, and actually tried to build a society on this.
The Nazis believed that instead of permitting natural forces and chance to control evolution, they must direct the process to advance the human race. The first step to achieve this goal was to isolate the inferior races in order to prevent them from further contaminating the Aryan gene pool. The Nazis believed that they were simply applying facts, proven by science, to produce a superior race of humans as part of their plan for a better world. The widespread public support for this policy was a result of the belief, common in the educated classes, in the conclusion that certain races were genetically inferior, as was scientifically proven by Darwinism. The business of the corporate state was eugenics or artificial selection, politics as applied biology. The result, 6 million Jews killed, nearly 63% of Jewish population in 22 European countries, in what became known as the Holocaust. The question that must be asked is, what is it about Darwin's theory and Origin of Species that seems to have influenced so many horrific events? Professor Robertson, who is quick to state that people commit atrocities, not theories, explains it this way.
If people take actions that devalue human life, the way I would put it is that those actions are compatible with Darwinism.
A clearer answer may lie in the book Darwin's Origin of Species set out to replace. In the Bible, the first chapter of Romans says, paraphrased, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, His eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools. Furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a depraved mind, so that they do what ought not to be done. They have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity.